Season 1 of Written in Stone, the 1990s, is supported by Tension Climbing, wooden training tools designed with purpose in Denver, Colorado. Use the code STONE, that's STONE, to get 10% off of your next purchase at tensionclimbing.com and to let them know that their support for this show matters. Not valid for tension board sets, hardware, or gift cards. Cannot be combined with other offers. Tensionclimbing.com. Mastery over success. We were way behind. What was once the epicenter of the climbing universe, Yosemite Valley, had gorged itself on its own legend and gotten lazy. Dull. Slow. The European climbers would show up and send the hardest routes in the valley on site and move on to other destinations. Destinations that were less, dated. And this version of climbing, held back by its adherence to outdated ethics and rules, threatened to become the entire identity of American climbing. But there were a few mavericks, clad in lycra and sporting mullets, who weren't having it. They would show up in the valley and clean up the old projects while the locals vandalized their cars and hurled threats, because the old hates it when the new comes crashing through the gates. But in reality, the old had plenty of opportunity to just open those gates. They chose not to. Instead, they added new locks. And so Todd Skinner, Christian Griffith, Lynn Hill, and Alan Watts each brought their own version of a battering ram. And perhaps the most potent of all the battering rams was wielded by Watts. Not only would he fully embrace rat bolting and hang-dogging, and in doing so, become a candidate for the best climber in the country, but he would recognize the hidden in plain sight potential of an old aid and crack climbing area in Oregon. He would climb the harder cracks and then turn his attention to the steep faces in between. He would envision, clean, and put bolts into harder routes than the U.S. had seen, connecting smaller and smaller features and moving further and further away from the stagnation of Yosemite Valley. And then they came. First the Australians, the British, the French. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, the best climbers in the world would come to Smith Rock, Oregon to test themselves on the routes that Watts had authored. It was never a question. They had to. These were the routes that would prove they wanted it, prove they had what it took. And some of the most staunch of the American traditionalists would follow, because they too had to prove their mettle. Because Alan Watts wasn't just bolting routes. He was building the future. And in doing so, writing history. Alan, welcome to Written in Stone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I have so many questions for you about that time in Smith Rocks, in the 90s when everything was just exploding. But to start, I have a question I have to ask you that popped up in my research. And I don't know if you've read Ron Fawcett's autobiography. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
Well, in it, he writes about Raventor. He says, "I've always thought of the crag as being a bit of a scruff. There's a story, I don't know if it's true, that visiting American climber Alan Watts drove past Raventor on his first visit, discounting the place as not worth the bother. He just kept going, expecting something more worthwhile around the corner." Is that true?
Well, I was there with Chris Grover. I mean, it actually is true. It wasn't that we just drove by thinking this couldn't possibly be it. It was just because we had in our mind that it was such a big influential place. And so we just drove by and it was like, that couldn't have been it. And then a few minutes later, it's like, that must have been it. So we circled back and turned around, and sure enough, that was Raven's Tor.
I love that. I love that its reputation and its legend is so big, but in reality, it's so small and scrappy that you just didn't even recognize it as what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually good climbing, but it's not unlike just driving by a road cut,
Yeah,
in
totally.
art climbing, where it's not something that you expect.
Yeah.
Think it's going to be
I love it.
grand.
I had to know if that was true. I want to start here with Jibé Tribout, because it seems like it would be really easy for you to hold a grudge. But in interviews and when I saw you speak this summer, you you spoke of him with the greatest of respect, and I'm curious why.
Well, I have tremendous respect for GB. I mean,
Yeah,
uh, most of what he did, like really, he played a huge role in kind of validating what was going on at Smith Rock. And, I did, there were a couple routes that I had prepared to bolt or not to be, just do it, very famous routes.
yeah,
Um, and I just openly, like, hey, these routes are here. They're too hard for me. Do them. And I mean, by that time, I started to identify with. I mean, early on in my climbing, it was all about me, but over time, anything that happened at Smith Rock sort of felt like it elevated everything, including myself.
mm,
So him doing to bolt or not to be, him doing just do it. It kind of felt like it was all. We were all part of the same team. It was the Smith Rock team, and so he was elevating Smith Rock. So
yeah,
yeah, he was very influential. I mean, just uh, how he came in there, and he was not growing up with all the controversy that we were facing in the United
right,
States, and so
right.
you could just see what somebody can do if they're not weighed down by all that baggage.
Wow, that's really kind of an amazing level of self-awareness and of awareness of what's going on at the time to have, that
I mean,
that
I
even
could have
in those
done.
times, you
Yeah, I
weren't.
could have. I mean, I did to Bolter Not to Be, and he did it in '86. I repeated it in '89. I could have said no, stay off
Yeah.
that route. I want that to be my route. I would have done it, but to Bolter Not to Be done by me in 1989 would not have had the influence
Mm,
that GB doing it in 1986 had. That route needed to be done
yeah.
when it was done. And the same thing for Just Do It. I never did Just Do It. But again, those things had to be done when they were done. They were time sensitive.
Wow, that's fascinating to me, Alan, and I know there was one situation, and I think lots of people get these situations confused. Um, I've heard lots of people say Tribou stole "Just Do It" from Alan Watts. He told him to stay off of it, but that was Badman that happened with, correct?
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of too bad. That was kind of surprised me that he did that. It was in 1990, I think, and he was at Smith Rock, and I just told him, he was just starting to work on Just Do It, and we were friends, and I went up to him and I said, GB, go at it with Just Do It, and I gave you to Bolt, and all I ask in return is just let me have this one route because I was really close
Mm,
to doing it, and was having problems with my fingers that only got worse. So I was having to take extended periods of time off. But I, had fallen on the last hard move of what came to be known as Bad Man, and he was like, okay. And it wasn't until a month after he did it that I had a friend call me up and say, yeah, you know what GB did. I just wanted
mm,
to say I thought that was really, really bad. But he had actually flown from Paris to Redmond, spent about a week there, and flew back. So he made an entire trip from Europe. That's my understanding.
did Badman, not Just
To
Do It,
do
right?
Badman, not to do
Yeah,
Just
yeah, yeah.
Do It.
Okay.
Just Do It came later, and it took him a lot of tries. But Badman, it was pretty clear what his intentions were.
Yeah. Do you have any idea why? Like, what do you think was motivating him to just go behind your back that way?
He was very competitive. I don't really know. I don't think it was. And I haven't talked to him since. I mean, when he was back and did Just Do It, we weren't. fighting or anything. We never really talked about that, and I haven't talked to him for years. I'm not sure what went through his mind. I think he has feels that maybe in Europe that would have been maybe the ethic in Europe, maybe that would have been okay. In the
Right.
U.S., that was before red tagging, but
Mm-hmm.
again, it wasn't like I had put some red tag at the base of the route. It was, a specific conversation. Please leave me with
Yeah.
this route. So
That's interesting. What you just said sparked something. He had this, like, he seemed to be driven by the competition with, like, Ben Moon. He and Ben Moon sparred a little, and there was competition between he and his other, the other French climbers, Didier and Patrick, and all of these folks. So maybe he was just latching on to that competition. Like, I need this to drive me, and didn't even notice it as a hurtful thing.
I suspect that might well be true. I mean, he was
Mm,
really driven. I mean, he was very good, very talented. I don't think he was the most talented climber of his generation, but I think he worked as hard, if not harder, than anybody.
yeah. The that does bring up something. Like, he certainly worked hard at his climbing. Um, but I have to, like, point out that developing these routes, especially at Smith, is hard work. So swooping in and just doing routes that have already been developed, um, if that were happening today, that would be like Jonathan Siegrist goes and bolts a route, and Adam Ondra just waiting in the shadows to sneak out and do the route as soon as Jonathan leaves.
Right. That holds climbing back. If you,
Yeah,
I mean, for Smith Rock, it kind of marked the end of the golden age, where once you realized, okay, well, we can't. If you spend days preparing a route, it doesn't mean that you're the one that's going to do it. And if
right.
that's the way it is, then why go through the work? Because it took, I don't know, to bolt or not to be. I'd looked through my notes, and I had spent 7 days preparing that before I ever got on it and climbed it. It took that long
Wow.
to just figure out, to clean off everything. And Badman was a mess. It was that Agro wall was really dirty, and every route there required a lot of cleaning. So again, I
Mm,
put a lot of time into that cleaning it. So
yeah. Well, I commend you on a number of levels here, Alan. It's, number one, putting those roots up, putting the work in to clean them up, and then number two, not holding a grudge and not having this continued animosity for Jibé, swooping in and doing these routes.
I mean, it's been 30 years. If I'm holding on to a grudge,
Sure, sure. But there are some people who would.
yeah, I'm just past that.
Yeah, I didn't go into this season, like, intentionally wanting to paint Tribout as a villain. Um, but the more and I don't think he is a villain, I don't think that at all. But in this big story, he definitely fills that role quite a few times with, like, betting against Lynn Hill. I think is a bad way to go on any
Sure.
occasion. And then, going toe to toe with Ben Moon several times,
Yeah,
and
and I didn't even know
antagonizing
about
that
that.
situation. Yeah. And then, swooping in and doing these routes in Smith. So I'm curious, what was he like when you know, just as a person, when you were there climbing with him, you were friends. What was the guy like?
I thought he was a really nice guy. I mean, we hit it off. I met him in a climbing competition in the Pyrenees in September
Mm-hmm.
of 1986, and by then Smith Rock had just become it was on the map. I mean, he knew who I was. He knew when I told him about Smith Rock, he said he'd already had. He said, I already have tickets. We're
Mm,
going next month to
wow.
Smith Rock, and when he was there, it was. I mean, I was in school at that point, so I wasn't around. I was in Eugene, and so I wasn't there all the time. But it was just very positive. He was a likable guy, very focused, but again, he was respectful. He was. It's hard for me to think about who he was apart from his climbing. But again, I
Sure.
he is somebody that made bunches of trips to Smith Rock, and so it was always great to see him.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. I want to make sure I don't paint him totally as a dark character throughout this season. And I think this episode that you haven't heard yet about Just Do It and Jibé Tribout, I don't think it really paints him as a villain. It does point out the things he did that were maybe not so nice, but I do think it really shows his like dedication and his work ethic and his drive and his competitiveness, which I think are necessary for moving things forward.
Yeah, I think there are times that his competitiveness just kind of what made him good. He occasionally crossed the line of how people normally, climbers, how we interact, and so he would occasionally, just in his drive to be the best, would sometimes
Sure.
step on some people's toes and offend them somewhere along the way.
Yeah, I'm sure I crossed a lot of lines and stepped on a lot of toes and offended a lot of people when I was in my 20s as
Yeah,
well.
I think we all did
Yeah,
unintentionally, and I think with
yeah,
GB, it was unintentional. I don't think he was an ass. I don't think he was just
yeah.
like, I'm sure at the time, I don't think it occurred to him when that he was doing something that would create some friction.
Yeah. Well, when I started writing this episode, I reached out to you via email to try to clear up a few things that I had heard, and this is where I think rumors just get perpetuated. I've looked at articles in Climbing Magazine that from back then that perpetuate these rumors. So I'm curious and I would like to sort of set the record straight a little bit here. Number one, we already went over, which is Jibé didn't steal Just Do It from you. I'm curious though, was it an open project? I've also heard Scott Franklin had sort of taken it over. What was the situation there?
Well, I bolted the route for it's the only route I ever bolted where it was basically a job. It was for NBC Sports World. They were doing a story
Mm.
on trying three of the top climbers in the world trying to do a hard first ascent at
Oh,
Smith
wow.
Rock. So I I had worked. It was with Mike Hoover, who did the Survival of the Fittest events,
Yep.
and being a Smith Rock local, he called me up and said, "Hey, what about this? I want to do this project. I want to bring Wolfgang Gulich in and Ron Kauk in, and the three of you team up to do a really hard route." And so he told me, you know, if you're interested, I need you to pick the route.
Mm.
And Just Do It hadn't been bolted, but I knew about that, and I was thinking this is the line. This is like the obvious, great filming. It was really spectacular. So I prepared the route for that. And
Wow.
then
I had no idea.
we had 3 days of filming. And Ron Kalk and I, the day before Wolfgang showed up, we went over and we tried it. And we realized this is going to be a problem because
Mm.
we had 3 days of filming. And you just, in 1989, that route was a lot harder than really anything else, and it would have been some really bad. Would have made for bad TV having us go up and fall off like just not far off the ground on this thing. And so anyway, that's once Wolfgang never even got on the thing. I tried it a few more times. That was the same season I was working to bolt, so that I wasn't putting much effort into Just Do It. I worked on it enough where I did the moves, and I just realized I don't have physically what it takes to do this route. And so once I
Mhm.
realized that, it was totally an open project. And
Got it.
um, yeah, Scott Franklin started working on it. I know DDA Rabitou worked on it quite a bit, was very close
Yeah.
to doing it.
Yep.
And yeah, so it was a completely open project.
Got it. Got it. What did you end up climbing on for the filming?
Um, well, it was just kind of a mess because I then bolted. The filming was done on the backbone on Monkey Face
Oh,
and
yeah.
a route called Sheer Trickery. That was basically what happened. I went around and I bolted an arete on the northwest side of Monkey Face, and put all the bolts in for that, and that route still hasn't been done. So as it turns
Mm.
out, after Just Do It was too hard, I then went and bolted a route that was even harder. It's fully prepared. It's probably 5:15, and so then we got on that, and couldn't even come. We weren't even close. So, but there was
Wow.
a 13A route above called the Backbone that, I mean, they pieced together this story.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was. I didn't do a very good job of. I mean, I did a great job. I created Just Do It, and but for the
For the
show,
film.
yeah, for the film, my eyes were way bigger than my ability.
Yeah. Well, before we move on with these questions, I'm curious, what was Wolfgang like?
Oh, I loved Wolfgang. He was, and I'd known him. He'd been at Smith Rock before that. I spent time with him in Germany back in 1986. Just such a kind, gentle
Mm,
person, humble. I mean, he was just like this. I don't know. He was the first European climber that I was really aware of that was like a hero of mine,
yeah.
because he had come to the United States, I think, in 1981 or 82, and I hadn't met him then, but so he was somebody I definitely knew about,
Hmm.
and when I met him, you don't know what you're going to expect, but I didn't expect somebody who was just so humble and
Yeah.
I don't know, just an absolute delight to be around.
Yeah.
Just a
That's what
real
I've heard over
Yeah,
and over. It's
yeah.
cool that just keeps getting reinforced.
Yeah, he was competitive, but again, it never. Um, I mean, anybody who got good at climbing had to want it. We had to be pretty, driven. He was certainly
Yeah.
driven, but there was no way he was not. It was for him. It was. I don't even know if he would have been capable of pissing somebody off. That just wasn't his way.
Yeah.
A gentle
Well,
soul.
one of the other things I want to know here is there are lots of, back in that era, chipping was accepted to some degree at least. Um, and I've heard rumors of Tribout chipping Just Do It and changing it from what it was when he first showed up. So I'm curious your take on that.
I was on, Just Do It, and then Scott Franklin started working on it, and then GB came and worked on it, and when Scott came back to it, he said it was changed. The holds were
Got it.
bigger, things had changed. I was never on the route after 1989. So
Got
once
it.
I decided I can't do this thing and other people started working on it, I didn't go back. So I don't know. I had no way of knowing what the route was like after, if there were changes. Um,
Hmm.
I'm sure that there were. Um, Smith Rock, the rock is soft. It's any route, any preparation. I don't think he was taking a power drill,
Right. Right.
but I have just no idea what was done. I'm sure it was, at least from what Scott said, some of the holds were improved. There was like a one finger pocket that had turned into a really good two finger pocket, and
Got
but
it.
this is all you probably know about as much as I do about.
Sure. Sure. One of the things Adam Ondra said was that, while he doesn't condone chipping in any form, uh, the the changes made to some of the holds on Just Do It, he felt made it a better route. That maybe there were some more comfortable holds, or it made the sequence a little better, or whatever that was that made the route a little better.
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. I don't think it was. It probably would have been a little bit harder, but what he did and to bolt or Just Do It, done in 1992, was the right. It was. It's a good thing that it happened. It wasn't like it's something he should have saved for future generations. That route needed to happen.
Yeah, I'm not at all trying to skewer Tribu here. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the rumors that circulate all around.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
think
if
it's true there were modifications to it, but
yeah,
in the process of any route at Smith Rock, if you would wrap down it the very first time before it had ever been touched, and then you look
yep,
at it now, holds are, a lot of times a pocket. You can take a toothbrush and just
yeah,
gouge out, brush out a pocket. It's a
yep.
really, really soft rock area, so it's not. Um, I think there were very, very few holds on that thing that were just manufactured. I'm sure of
Right.
that. I'm sure 99% natural.
Got it. Was there a working name for it? Like, I know you were initially calling chain reaction like corner root number 1 or something. So, what was there a working route for just or a working name for just do it?
I think it was just the east wall of Monkey Face or something like that. It wasn't. They
Yeah.
all just had. Oh, my working names were not very imaginative. Yeah, and then yeah, once I abandoned it, I don't know if Scott was referring to it as something. I don't really know. It wasn't a route. It was a route that was named. The name "Just Do It" didn't come until after the route was done. Some
Right.
routes have a name that
Yeah.
they acquire fairly early. So, but "Just Do It" came up. It wasn't until 1992, after the ascent, that I heard that name.
Yeah. Um, One of my favorite parts of the video of Ondra on-sighting it is watching you. You're there watching him do it, and it looks like you're getting so much joy out of watching this happen. Can you tell me a little bit about that day and what it was like watching Adam do this thing first try?
It was a great day, and I had had a hip replacement, gosh, like 5 weeks before that, and so I had
Mm,
been really confined to my home and was using a walker and, finally got walking sticks, and I was just trying to. That's a depressing thing, to get the hip replaced and not be able to do anything, and so all of a sudden, and I had heard that Adam was gonna be coming to Smith Rock. And I'm not a social media person, but he has a public Facebook page. And so for every morning for a while, I was looking at his page. And then one day, all of a sudden, it was like, whoa, that's Mount Jefferson in the background. That's Smith. And so I
mm.
knew he was there before I'd heard he was there. So I just drove out with my walking sticks, and it probably wasn't the best thing to do, but I just hobbled into the park, to meet the guy.
Yeah,
And we just hung out pretty much. I was there every day he was climbing, and so by the time he did Just Do It, I we were friends, and he was we I really enjoyed my time with him, and he's the exact same age as my son, and
mm,
I felt, I don't know, there was something that I just felt really close to him. So when he went over to do Just Do It, I was rooting for him. I didn't think he was going to do it. I was There's just so many places. He tried to
sure.
do the bolt, his foot popped. He looked
Yeah,
great, and it was a cold day. It was just so. I just didn't. I don't know. I didn't think. I didn't. I probably would have given him like a 10% chance of succeeding on the route. And I was just over in a vantage point, kind of alone. Although, as it turns out, I wasn't alone because I was getting filmed. I didn't realize. I didn't realize that. But in some ways, that made it better, because if there would have been a camera in my face and I would have known it, I think I would have been more stoic. I don't think you would have seen what
yeah,
it actually meant to me.
yep,
But, I'm watching him do it. He gets through the lower part, which is like 13D, 14A, but is really techy, and a lot of people fall off there. I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of where I thought he would fall off. But once he kept going, getting higher and higher, it was like a sporting event, like you're
yeah,
a memory where I am seeing this, the 3-point shot to win the championship sort of thing. That's the way it felt. And watching it, it was the greatest thing I've ever seen in climbing,
mm,
period. Certainly at Smith Rock. And for me, there was a lot of emotion, because there were so many memories of, like, as I was watching him, I was just kind of thinking about when I was growing up, when I first climbed Monkey Face, when I was, aid climbing it, when I was 15 years old, and then all the routes that I had done on Monkey Face and
Yeah.
just the whole lifetime of climbing at Smith. I was there when Kris Sharma did the route in 1997
And
and
took his
watched
shirt
that.
off midway.
Yeah, and so and for me, it was just I don't know. I just thought about what he was doing and the context and how it fit into my life and the story of Smith Rock. And one thing that I wrote about that was that Smith Rock by that time was not anywhere close to Smith in the 80s, early 90s was like the place. And now it's more of a historical place. There's still not a 515 at Smith Rock.
Right.
But the fact that Adam Ondra, he could go anywhere, in the U.S., he could do anything, anywhere, but he chose to come to Smith Rock and do that. And it seemed like the fact that Smith Rock still had the drawing power to get Adam to, come here and do it. At that moment, at that day, the attention of the entire climbing world was back on Smith, because that was whatever happened in the climbing world on November, whatever it was, in 2018, his ascent was the best thing that was happening. And so it kind of just felt like I don't know, just like bookends of this time from long ago, and then this the past connecting to the future. And I admit I got a little emotional. I mean, I was watching him and just like and when he finally did it, I was the first one to scream out, because I knew, once he had this hold, it was over. And then there were probably 50 people watching, and it was like, he came down off the route, went back up the hill, gave me a huge hug. And it was just like, wow, this is wonderful. Like, this is so great.
What an amazing person to have, like, at the pinnacle of the sport right now. Like, he respects the history. He's such a kind person and a giving person. And I just think it's amazing that he's the one leading the charge.
Yeah, I think if I would have been Adam Ondra, I don't think I would have been quite as kind and giving. He is just, he's just such a nice person.
Yeah. Well, it occurs to me, Alan, that, you bolted Just Do It for a film project that at the time was going to, show these climbers doing something groundbreaking. And you just didn't know it was going to be a film 30 years later that happened there that showed something totally groundbreaking.
No, I've never looked at it that way, but that's totally true. And that video has certainly been viewed a lot.
I wrote an article right after it came out when he put the video out of his commentary over top of it. And I wrote an article for our website that said, Adam Ondra just gave us a Christmas gift, this commentary on top of this video of this groundbreaking ascent is amazing.
Oh yeah. I was surprised how many times I would be recognized just from being in an Adam Ondra video. It was like, wow. I thought that was cool.
Wow. You mentioned that you had spent a lot of time on Monkey Face, and it's this like prominent feature. Like, you can't go to the park and not remember that feature. And in the episode about Just Do It, I talk about Tribout is coming down from the east face of Monkey Face, your route. And that's when he sees the bolts of Just Do It and decides, he sort of scopes it out and decides that's what the future is. I read this in an article from, the early 90s that he says all this.
Well, that's interesting. It's not maybe the way I remember it, but
how do you remember it? I'm curious.
Well, he had repeated the east face of Monkey Face. He had fixed the nuts in it, so you didn't have to put the gear in, which probably made it a bit easier. But he repeated it before he did to bolt.
Okay.
So, and I don't think he went back to do it again. And when he would have lowered down in 1986, he would have seen the line over there. but there would have been no bolts. The bolts were added 3 years later. So
Oh, interesting.
yeah, the story's probably not exactly because the bolts couldn't have been there,
Interesting.
and there's no way. I don't think he ever would have gone back.
Hey, this is Kris. I'm just breaking in here while I'm editing because I think this is a really interesting moment in the conversation. After Alan told me that that's not how it could have happened, I went back and did some research, and he's absolutely right. There's no way that the way I had written it is what's true. So I did change it in the episode, so you didn't hear that at all. You're just hearing this for the first time. And I'm leaving in the rest of what we talk about here because I think it's a really important take on history and how it's recorded and then how it's passed on and eventually becomes fact, even though it may not be because our memories are so fallible. And that's an important part of the show, so I'm leaving it in. All right. That's really interesting, and that's actually one of the reasons I love digging into this history is not to correct it, but because our memories sort of they change over time, and Tribout said in an article back then, when I was lowering down, I saw this route that Alan had bolted, and so I suspect he was just combining memories
And
of.
I do that we all do.
Yeah,
It's
we do.
amazing,
Absolutely.
like, my memory for old things, like, I still remember, like, exact sequences of routes from 40
Right,
years
right.
ago, things like that. I don't remember what I did yesterday, but I remember, I remember that. But I'm amazed how many times I will tell somebody a story with, talking to somebody else who was there, and they will say, "No, no, no, you're getting this confused with," and they'll give me this irrefutable evidence that I've got
Yeah.
the stories jumbled.
Yep,
You know,
yep.
people who I was sure, um, somebody that belayed me on a route, and then it was like, no, it was a totally different person, and it was like and I think that happens to all of us. So,
Yeah.
in some ways, I, maybe I should not have told you. I should have just let his. It's a better. It's a
No,
better
I think it's
story.
fine.
What he is saying is a better story than me saying no, that couldn't have happened because the bolts weren't there.
No, I think that's totally fine. I think we just have to accept that that's what happens with our memories, and we combine things to turn them into better stories, and that's what I do with this podcast. Like, I'm trying to tell the interesting story, and I say at the end of every episode, like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And I really believe that. Like, I want to build these things up. I don't want to like rewrite history, but I also
Yeah.
am not so interested in the absolute facts that I'm going to turn it into this dry thing.
Because at this point, you're not gonna uncover the absolute facts.
Right. Totally.
Everybody has a kind of a different memory, different interpretation, and so a lot of times you ask all the questions, you talk to everybody, and you just piece together the best version of the story, and that's
Yeah.
just as accurate as anything else.
Yep. Well, there's so many different examples of pushing toward the future that played out in Smith, in the 90s, and I think that's a testament to your vision. And when I talked with Adamandra for this podcast, we spent a bit of time talking about how important that vision that you had was and is, and how unique it is. And in fact, I'd argue that it was, at least in part, your roots, your vision that helped Tribout become a major player that he was in the 90s. Certainly he came and did the roots, but without those roots, there would have been nothing there to do. And I
If he
think
would have
that's all
shown up
you.
and tried to do those routes as they were, he would have wrapped down and like, "Ugh, no, there's
Yeah,
nothing here," because I don't think he would have spent the, 6, 7 days of work cleaning and
right.
meticulously planning it. I mean, there's some truth to that, but, and if he hadn't, what he did at Smith Rock, what played a huge part in his legacy. Um, so, I mean, I might take a credit just, for a little bit. I'm not the one that did the routes, but, um,
Yeah.
we both owe something to each other for that, because if
Yeah.
he wouldn't have done those routes, the Smith Rock story wouldn't have been quite as good as it was. And if those routes
Yeah.
wouldn't have been there, his story wouldn't have been quite as good. So there was some mutual, we were it benefited each other.
Yeah. What do you think beyond, what you and Jibé were doing there? What's the magic that Smith has that you sort of showed the world that, made it the place it was in the 90s and still is today?
It's a good question because it's magical. I mean, it's a beautiful, magical place. I think I wrote in like my first history of my first Smith Rock guidebook that Smith Rock rose to fame despite the quality of the rock, not because of
Mm.
it. And so it
Mhm.
was sort of unusual in that it wasn't. There were certainly far better crags have been developed all around the world. Smith Rock was the perfect place for sport climbing to start in the U.S. for a lot of reasons, and one of the reasons is that the rock was bad enough and where you couldn't use the traditional approach of starting from the
Mm.
ground and drilling, and because you'd be encountering all these loose flakes
Right,
and
right.
everything. And the rock also had to be soft enough so you could hand drill all the early sport routes.
Right.
Now, if some of these really overhanging limestone, some of these amazing crags, good luck trying to
Yeah.
hand drill,
Yep.
you know, 3.5, 4 inch holes. Um,
Yeah.
on an overhang. So it kind of worked, and there were just things that just kind of came together. There were a lot of people. I mean, it was not just that I had this vision and I made this happen. I did have this vision, and I did make things happen there, but um, everybody else had to enter the scene. If I'd never known Todd Skinner, it would have been the story would have unfolded in a different way.
Yeah.
All these people who were players. Yeah, I could go on and on about that, and I've been thinking about that, about why things unfolded the way they did. It was almost like it was meant to be, because it wasn't like Smith Rock. It's some great climbing, but it's not just the best, most natural climbing area in the world. It was kind of a junk pile.
Yeah, well, I mean, we started this episode talking about Raventor, and, it's a similar
Yeah,
situation, like, not the grand,
yeah, visually
um
much more impressive, but
yeah,
rock quality, Ravens Tor was a step above Smith Rock.
yeah, that's
Just
interesting.
natural rock quality. Yeah.
So, it's like right place, right time, right vision, I think that's what it
Everything,
comes
yeah,
down to.
everything kind of had to align, and by the time, again, if people have asked me, like, well, if I didn't do some of the routes I did in '83 or '84, way back then, and um, obviously they would have been done eventually, but things it was very time critical the way things lined up, and that's what is kind of
Yeah,
amazing to me is all those routes done, every one of those routes done 20 years later, it would be like, so what, another good climbing area. But when
right.
they happened in the sequence that they happened, that um, yeah, I played a role, but somehow it seemed like it was so much bigger than any of the individuals. It
Yeah.
was really this
Well
collective thing.
well, thank you for the role that you played, and for, recognizing back then that some of the rules needed to be broken in order to push the sport forward, even if the American scene was, like, kicking and screaming in protest. Thank you for noticing that, and for being so quick to understand that the next generation was also pushing forward in their own way, and being accepting of those sorts of things. Um, Getting to introduce you this summer, here in Lander at the Climbers Festival was my last introduction of a long climbing festival MC career, and it was a real highlight for me, a really, really special moment, and I'm really glad that I got to do that. And when we get to a season about the 80s on this show, you're going to play such a massive part.
It'll be fun. I'll be looking forward to it. And again, your introduction, I felt it was like, there's people there. I'm talking to everybody. It's just kind of busy. It's also like 10
of course.
night. And then I was thinking, that was the best, that introduction. That was the best introduction because I'm sure I've given 100 climbing presentations. And I was like, that was probably the best introduction I'd ever received because it wasn't just something that somebody had, Googled and read. It was like this original, very well thought out and well presented introduction. And I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Alan. I put a lot of time into those because I respect what you've done. And thank you for your time here. I appreciate it so much.
Absolutely.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Kris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. At the link in your show notes, you'll find all the things you expect and probably some you don't, including some great photos of Alan Watts in tights from the 80s and 90s. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, at parties where everyone is just talking about climbing anyway, and share it all over your social medias, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret stoners. I'm still a little amazed at how calm and cool Alan was about Jibé stealing Badman from him in the way that he did. I suspect that in my 20s, I would have handled it pretty differently. And I guess a lot of you probably would have as well. A lot of people have gotten way more angry for way smaller things. But ultimately, I love Alan's class and the way he thinks through things. And I love his perspective of the timing of how things happened in Smith. That's really cool to hear. He also sent me a few photos just tonight. I'm recording this, the night before this thing drops. Just tonight, he sent me some photos that I'm posting in the Patreon right now that are, one is a photo of Alan jokingly choking Jibé. The other is of Jibé at the party. Both of these are from the party that I talk about in the beginning of the Jibé Tribout episode, the Just Do It episode. And the photo was taken immediately after he finished his 80 pull-ups. He was handed a beer, he chugged it, he threw the can to the floor, I guess in victory. And you can really see it in his face in the photo. It's pretty amazing. Before I even knew what the photo was or what moment it was, I was like, oh, he's on something in this photo. So you guys should go to the Patreon, check those out. Shout out to our third legend supporter, Jason. We appreciate you. And if you guys have not joined, it's free. or you can support if you'd like. There's a $10 a month support option there. There are going to be bonus episodes coming over there, bonus content, things like that. But for now, go check out these photos. They're free for everybody to see over on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club, all one word. Next week, I've got another bonus episode for you. There's one thread that I've been fascinated with through reading about this season, and that's the rivalry between the French climbers and the British climbers who, it seems like the Germans were kind of quietly doing their own thing and being badasses, and the French and the Germans, or the French and the British, both had their egos involved a little. How could you not? We're 20-something-year-old kids at the top of the game. So it's a really cool story, I think, the back and forth, especially between Ben Moon and Jibé Tribout. So that is next Monday. Hope you all have a fantastic weekend. I'm going to go post those photos in the Patreon right now for you to check out. See you next week.